A lot to unpack there from Bob's interview with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. To help us, we're going to turn to the nation's leading thinkers, strategists, and policy practitioners. Over the next 40 minutes or so, we're going to embark on a focused discussion about the global chessboard, what America needs to create a new baseline for its national security posture and defense needs. Then in the second band of our event, coming up at 1:15 p.m., we're going to focus on defining frames and priorities for hard-edged thinking and investment in American security for the next century. And we have a fascinating, super cool James Bond lineup. What buckets need to be in the mix? What are the programs and assets that make sense for the future? Which have diminishing utility? Before we get underway, a few housekeeping notes. You can tweet us at #TheHillNatSec. That's the Hill, N-A-T-S-E-C. We are broadcasting live. We're going to be taking your questions throughout the program, and I will ask them. As with any live stream, you could experience occasional trouble with the video. Refreshing the page should, in most cases, fix the problem. I don't buy it, but maybe it'll work for you. Now, please join me in welcoming Nicole Bibbins Sedaca, professor in the practice of international affairs at Georgetown University. She has held numerous positions in the public and non-governmental sectors in the United States and Ecuador, including serving for a decade in the State Department. She also worked with an organization I have a great deal of respect for, the International Republican Institute. Professor, thanks so much for joining us. I was taken by an op-ed you wrote in January, before the COVID crisis hit, that really began to kind of question this question of what America is about. I've talked to Anne-Marie Slaughter about this same sort of thing in the past. And you quoted Ronald Reagan speaking in the British Parliament in 1982, Reagan saying, "So let us ask ourselves, what kind of people do we think we are? And let us answer, free people, worthy of freedom, and determined not only to remain so, but to help others gain freedom as well." In our national security dashboard, where does that fit today for the United States?
Well, first, Steve, let me say thank you for convening this timely conversation and for welcoming me into the conversation. It fits centrally to our national security interests. If you listen to the words that the Secretary of State just said and the countries that he named, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, very diverse countries, different sizes, different regions, different economies, different militaries. The one thing that they all have in common is that they are all autocracies. They are all authoritarian regimes trying to undermine democracy around the world. And so when we think about this concept of chessboard, the division between the two sides is really one of democracy and on one side and authoritarians on another. And it's not, when we think about democracy and democratization, it's not a secondary interest. It is intricately intertwined with our national security interests, because the greatest threats do come from authoritarian nations. Those countries that don't want to respect international standards at home in the treatment of their people and the openness of their systems also disrespect international standards globally, and that impacts American security and international security around the world.
Right now, we have a White House that doesn't seem comfortable with a lot of the international deals that got set up, whether it's the United Nations, withdrawing from the World Health Organization, knocking NATO around, pulling out of the Paris Accords. As you look at these institutions that we used to look at as sort of giving echo and greater support, if you will, to American foreign policy, as you see America move into a different direction, are you worried about America being able to pursue the values you just talked about?
I am. I'm greatly concerned. And the reason is, when we step back, there is a vacuum, and that vacuum will unquestionably be filled by authoritarian governments. There's no doubt about it. Many of those organizations have room for improvement, and they have issues where we need to engage, and we need to help them live into the very values that they were established on. And Secretary Pompeo pointed to some shortcomings, obviously, with China and the WHO, but we will be able to have those organizations do their job better when the United States is engaged and leading. And what we know is, when the United States leads, democratic countries around the world will follow. And so it's important that the United States, for its own security and for global security, is engaged. All of these systems were established on the very values that the United States was also established, and that the United States helped create in the international system. It was created, the international system was created with collaboration, openness, transparency, and democratic values. If we step back and there is a vacuum, it will be filled by authoritarian governments who have no intention including China, who have no intention of having those operating procedures and those values be at the corner of these organizations.
All of the trends you outlined, both in the piece you wrote for CNN, but you've just described, were in place before the coronavirus hit. What has COVID-19 done to the international order and America's place in the world?
So the pandemic that we're seeing around the world has exacerbated many of the problems that existed before. It has created new ones, but we have seen all of the problems that we're seeing now or problems that were nascent before. China's closed system, its failure to respond to citizens' input or respect a scientist's view of the concerns in the health system. Even in our own country, many of the challenges we have with weak democratic institutions in some places, health disparity between different races, all of these things which we're seeing now in the pandemic have been exacerbated by the pandemic, but they existed before. The question that we need to look at now is how do democracies and the United States in a leadership role respond and utilize the democratic institutions, utilize the democratic values that we have in place to show that those values, transparency, responsiveness, citizen engagement, conversation between civil society and government, that those are the values that are actually going to help us have the most effective response to a pandemic like this and will make us stronger coming out of it.
I don't mean to be facetious about this because I buy most everything you've said, but I do think that something happened in America a while back, before the Trump administration, where a lot of Americans began to feel that the payoff for them of being so involved in international affairs wasn't working out like it used to. That there used to be a kind of a quid pro quo, that America was the security guarantor of the world, built these institutions, but they felt that they sort of fought the Cold War and China won. How do you get back to Americans having faith in a global order that really does move their interests forward, as opposed to China's or India's or other nations that aren't investing what we're doing? Because I think it's a real issue at the core of a lot of the ambivalence about global affairs today.
Absolutely. And I don't want to minimize the concern of any American, because all Americans should be engaged and knowledgeable about our foreign policy and how it relates to our domestic policy. I think we have had a shortage of conversation with the American people to explain well why our engagement in the world is actually serving Americans' interests. If we explain it singularly through a military explanation or singularly through the loss of jobs in one sector, it's no surprise when Americans in certain segments of our society say this globalization thing or this engagement in the world is not paying off. But we have a responsibility, we meaning our government, those of us in the sector that deals with international affairs, we have a responsibility to be in conversation, first to listen to American citizens, but also to explain why the engagement in the world is necessary. And I think that as Americans hear about how the United States is engaging and standing for the values on which our country was founded, how we are engaging to open markets for American businesses, how we're engaging so that our military engagement, our diplomatic engagement, our economic engagement is opening markets, it is advancing democracy. Americans understand that. I serve as a fellow for the Bush Institute, the George W. Bush Institute, and we've had the opportunity to go around to a number of different places to talk with young people, talk with civic leaders about the report that we brought out just around the time of that CNN piece, to talk about the importance of democracy. And while people have a lot of tough questions and they have a lot of concerns, they unquestionably understand when you're in dialogue with them about the importance of democracy and of U.S. leadership and engagement in the world on democracy. What we need is leadership, strong communication, a willingness to listen to the American people, but also a willingness to explain why our policies are serving the interests and not at odds with them.
Let me just ask finally a question about soft power versus hard power. A lot of people in government today, in this administration, sort of scoff at the soft power idea that American values matter, et cetera. This was a concept that Joseph Nye at Harvard and worked in the Clinton and I think the Obama administration's popularized, but the notion of soft power out there, and a lot of what you're saying sounds like soft. Does American Future still have a place where soft power has to be part of its national security dashboard?
Absolutely. And they're not mutually exclusive. We have to have a complex toolbox that includes the tools of soft power and hard power, and we need to utilize them as necessary at different times. We can't use one at the exclusion of the other. We certainly can't exclude hard power and only go with soft power, nor can we do it the other way. But the reality is the United States still remains, for many people, the place where they are attracted to American values and attracted to American entrepreneurship and American innovation. And there is a desire to engage the United States. We have to do this humbly, but we have to do it with the confidence that we are a country that was founded on values that then underpinned the international system, and do it with respect and engagement of our international partners. And it's not mutually exclusive to have that soft power engagement, that conversation with other countries in a way that serves American interests, but also serves global interests. And those global interests come back to serve American interests ultimately as well.
Well, Professor Nicole Bibbins Sedaca, thank you so much for joining us from Georgetown University today. There's so much more I could have gotten into, like what you're going to do with your students coming up, but I hope you'll come back and share with us again.
It would be my pleasure. Thanks for hosting this event and for having me be a part of it.
Thank you.